God never wants us to stay in the same place. He's a wonderful God. He's a God of movement. And being on holiday in a place where there's a greater sense of spirituality makes me impatient for a change in our society. You can just be walking along with somebody and you can have a talk about spiritual things and they got it. Whereas you would never do that in England, would you? And, even the Americans at breakfast, bless them, some were obviously saying their private grace. And some even had Bible verses tattooed on their arms. And I'm praying in our society for a transforming change. And we need to be prepared to move into that space because society will need us to help them. Right. We've almost had enough, haven't we? This gift of giving. So today I've deliberately split the issue of church finances and a preach about giving in the final talk in our Generous January series. Hopefully you're getting a drift of what all these talks have been about. We end up doing the right thing because of the changes in the condition of our heart that is brought about when we come into a real relationship with God through the love and reality of Jesus being in our lives. So sometimes when we talk about something, it's the right thing to do. But in God's eyes, why we do things is often as important as doing the right thing. You get that? And this is the same about giving. Jesus has nothing to say about church finances. Churches hadn't been invented when he was on the earth, nor about tithing. However, he has a lot to say about giving, and also his life is a complete example of what it means to give. And he gave everything. So, as we finish our talk, we're going to come around the communion table this morning to remember to give thanks and to celebrate Jesus' ultimate gift to us, which is life-changing. And it's wondrous. So when we're talking about giving, I just want to get one thing straight, that God doesn't need our money. He doesn't need. He has access to whatever resources he wants. The whole universe is what God wants. He wants our hearts to be completely devoted to him. He wants our hearts to reflect his son's love for us. But if you look at any human being, one of the things that tells you where their heart is how they deploy their financial and time resources. That reveals so much about actually where their heart is. So you get this, God doesn't need our money, but a heart turned towards God will want to deploy all resources towards God, because that is what a heart that's completely 100% turned towards God should be like. This is not a surprise, is it? That some evidence this week that our society is getting more selfish. Research published this week in the Times, so it's got to be right, shows that the wealthiest 10% of the population donate half as much as a proportion of their income as those in the poorest 10%. So the poorest 10%, as a proportion of what they have, give twice as much as the wealthiest 10%. Despite over the last 7 years and all the troubles, the wealthier have become wealthier, but the amount that they've given has reduced. And too many people assume that the government will always step in. And we know that a government's a blunt instrument, and sometimes it helps, and sometimes it doesn't. And social care and the care for society was invented by the church You know, in our world, we can get this the wrong way around. We think, oh, we live in a society where the government cares for the people. The church invented that, and the government nicked it. But the governments and their priorities are not always God's priorities. So that there's very much is a niche for people to still give. You know, philanthropy, that's giving of your own resources, in the 19th century changed our country. You know, it's important for anybody that's wealthy in here, so I'm looking at lots of you. When the wealthiest, so it's really important that the poor give, but it's important that the wealthy give as well. When the wealthy give back, they bring lots of things that everybody else can't bring. They bring networks, expertise, the love for the places that they grow up, the passion for causes that have touched their lives. And that last sentence, there's some great reasons why we should give. Passion for the causes that have touched our lives. And what more passion could you have than somebody who has renewed your life and given you a hope for eternal life? At the same time, there are some less positive reasons why we might give. You know, that some wealthy people give so they might get a peerage, become lord or lady. And we've been reading about that in the last week or two, haven't we? Sometimes people give generously, but partly to show off to others what a good egg and how much money they've got. We, too often when we give as people, tell people, really, look at me, how great, nice, considerate, and well off I am. Jesus tells us that those people have already received their reward. They get their reward from the admiration of other people. People who are interested in what God thinks and maybe being rewarded from God give privately so that the issue is only between them and God. Just hear what Jesus has to say on the matter of giving. So in Matthew 6, verses 1 to 4 in the NIV, it says, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full." Doesn't say, but if you give to the needy, but when you give. So giving's important, but when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. So God's not interested in your money, but he's interested in your heart and how that motivates you to action. So remember, it's when we give to the needy. It's not if. Just because we're saying God doesn't need your money, he wants your heart to be moved in a way that you just want to help them, but you don't want the world to know, because then that tells you that your heart's in a different place. You know, it's clear that God is no man's debtor. In Luke 6, Jesus teaches us the principles of sowing and reaping. If we sow generously in lots of different aspects of our life, it will be amazing what we reap. If we sow miserly, we will reap miserly. And this relates to our whole life, not just money. But in Luke 6, verse 38, we read, "Give, and it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over." All words that talk about more than enough will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. The pulpit commentary says this verse, 19th century language, "The grand characteristic feature of the society of his followers must be generosity. They must be known among men as givers rather than judges. That's what we should be known for. Boundless generosity, limitless kindness to all, saint and sinner. That is what he, the master, will press home to those who follow his lead. So generosity should be part of who we are as followers of him. In two stories, Jesus clearly teaches us that it is everyone's duty to give. And if you've been blessed with more earthly treasures then your responsibility increases in proportion to what you have. Important lessons can be learnt through the parable of the talents and the lessons of the widow's mite. These are very well known stories, but I just wanted to reflect this morning on what Jesus had to say about giving and what his take on it was. And there was no legalism, but as I said, although it concentrates on why, the fact that we should give is assumed. That when we give, not if we give. So in Luke 21 verses 1 to 4 we read, as Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins, or in older versions, the widow's mite. Truly I tell you, he said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth or their excess, but she gave out of her poverty, and she put in all she had to live on. Here Jesus doesn't say, if you're too poor, don't give, but emphasize that God doesn't look at an amount. It looks at what it means to you when you give it. Going back just really briefly, because I didn't really want to get into the Old Testament, we learned that our gifts that we give and our tithe should be from our first fruits rather than what's left over. Because if it's from our core income, then it's important to us. If it's from leftover, well, it's our discretionary income, if you like, in today's terminology. When I was growing up, and you were like at your grandma's or something like that, and my grandma was a Christian, you still get your weekly wage in cash. And I can remember seeing people like my older relatives dividing up the money, in the weekly money, and their gift to their church was there alongside the money for the rent, for the food, for the heating, for the penny insurance, all those things. And it wasn't, we'll pay for them, and then if we got anything left, we'll give to God. But it was part of their first fruits. It's part of their core income. That was giving from your first fruits. It's giving from the core of what you received and waiting to see if you've got anything left over, then you just toss it into the collection bag. In Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30, we read about the parable of the talents. Some commentators think a talent was a big monetary unit. Some commentators said worth 20 years wages for a labourer. So I'm not sure whether that's fully true, but it wasn't a little bit of money. This was a big amount of money, and we'll read through it. I've chopped the middle bit out because it's a long bit, but this is what it says. For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants, this is Jesus speaking, and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with him and made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid the master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled the accounts with them. This is my abbreviation now for a few verses. Basically, the men who received 5 and 2 talents doubled their money and were rewarded. Then back to the Bible verse. He who also had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, you wicked and slothful servant. It sounds like me talking to my kids. You knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scatter no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what is my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. Into that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I thought we were a bit harsh, that at the end from Jesus. But he was just really emphasizing in this story how important it is to use whatever God gives you and to use it generously. So here we have key lessons. We are to use whatever we've been given and to invest it into the work of God. Having little is not an excuse for not investing what we have. Also, look at things differently. It looks at things differently to how we would look at it. It's clear that it's an expression of our hearts that defines our priorities, and that's what God looks at. It's also clear that greater natural wealth brings greater responsibility, but no one is exempt from giving because of their lack of wealth. We must work with whatever we have been given. Another time when Jesus emphasized that giving is wonderful, but giving from the right attitude is even better, is in Luke 14, verses 12 to 14. And he said, then he turned to his host. When you put on a luncheon or a banquet, he said, don't invite your friends, brothers, Graham, you're out, mate, relatives and rich neighbours, for they will invite you back, and that will be your only reward. Instead, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Then at the resurrection of the righteous, God will reward you for inviting those who could not repay you. It's just a wondrous story, isn't it? So it's clear that Jesus is less concerned about what you do than how you do it. And the motivation behind what you do is all important. This giving is a matter of the heart. So in conclusion, don't give to receive or to show off. Do it because you want to reflect the heart of God. In that, he gave the most precious thing that he had, his Son, Jesus Christ, for the salvation of people who have messed up, walked away from him, let him down, denied his name, done horrible things, turned away from him. God did that for us. Jesus was obedient to his Father and gave everything for us. Clearly, a generous heart overflowing with love of God is brought about by being in relationship with Jesus Christ is one of the most wonderful things anyone can encounter. To be effective in mission, we need to show our generosity in everything we do. People will be attracted to you because of what you reflect. And we reflect a great God who is generous in everything he does and all his gifts to us. And we need to reflect that in our attitudes, in our behavior, in how we interact with people.